All right. Well, good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Matt.
Okay. Well, our last discussion was on self-relationality, and as we joked, it's a topic on everyone's mind, and it actually is, just people aren't aware of it. But we thought a good follow-up on that would be to talk about your work on self-worth theory, so which is the basis for a book that you wrote, I think published back in 2017 with Marty Covington and Linda is it Hone?
Von Hone.
Okay. Which we're going to discuss next time, but we wanted to just focus on self-worth theory and how that relates to self-relationality and everything else, and obviously how it relates to us practically every day. So with that, I kick it over to you to get us rolling.
Thanks, Matt. First, so self-worth theory is I'm going to use that term a lot, and my notes always write SWT because it's long. But self-worth theory, first, is a really broad paradigm. It's a way of looking at human beings and the human condition from a psychological point of view. You can contrast that with a philosophical or biological, but it's very broad and capacious, and it's so basic in psychology that sometimes it's not even noticed. So if you read a research article, or a book that might adopt in some fundamental way a self-worth theory or self-worth theory paradigm, so I might say something more broad or abstract even than a theory. A paradigm is kind of a way of seeing the world, of framing it, an orientation. It won't even get mentioned because it's so basic. Does that make sense? But it's operating in the thinking, in the conceptual frameworks of the researchers or writers without them realizing it. So a lot of psychotherapy, Rogerian psychology, so Carl Rogers, very influential in the 50s and 60s and the 70s, and is very powerfully influenced psychotherapy today, for instance, I think would be located in a self-worth framework. If you've read or heard the book Whistling Vivaldi, Claude Steele talks about stereotype threat. Claude Steele locates that, I think it's on page 39 or maybe 29. It's been a while since I read the book. He says, oh, this comes out of a self-worth perspective, but it's really almost like an offhanded point. So the significance of that is to say that there's a couple things operating in our everyday experience. If as a human being in the world, you notice, oh, psychotherapy, and it comes from this certain perspective, unconditional positive regard of Rogerian psychotherapy and thinking about the self. And then in a research context, and we're walking around the world, Whistling Vivaldi that you might not even know is informed and influenced by a self-worth theory. So having said that, I learned from Marty Covington, a prominent psychologist, wrote 10 books, a couple hundred articles, empiricist, but really coming out of a humanistic framework of psychology. But so he was like an educational psychologist, a social psychologist, personality psychologist. He's also interested in individual differences. So he really had a wide view, and maybe in a time in psychology you could do that and still get tenure. Nowadays it's very specialized, and I say that because very holistic. He wasn't tied to some of the disciplinary frameworks or ways of seeing. I think he was thinking about human beings. He would use things like phrases like love of learning and noble values. These are really hard things to measure in empirical psychology, and maybe don't have a lot of cachet, aren't used a lot in the literature. But that's how he was as a human being, approaching this question of who are we, why do we do what we do, and I never heard him use the phrase self-relationality exactly, though he did write quite a powerful article on what he called self-processes, and Alfred Bandura called self-processes. So that's kind of the big, you might say, theoretical background, as I understand it, of self-worth theory. Any reactions to that, Matt? Just so I'm not just blathering on.
Right. Well, how about just a quick definition of self-worth theory for everyone out there watching or listening to this?
Great. So Marty would describe it as, and I've adopted that framework, as, the human beings have the fundamental or paramount need to maintain their sense of self as worthy, deserved, in some sense good, and that to maintain that perception of others of them as well. So this is where the social psychological dimension is. There is this there is a basic understanding that our sense of ourselves, our self-regard, is fundamental. And not only fundamental, but paramount. It is the highest need, and also this kind of the most basic way of interacting with the world. And integral to that is how we believe other people view us and perceive us and regard us and assess us and evaluate us or ourself, right? So I think you can see the resonances with what we talked about last time, self-relationality.
Yeah, I'm curious because I think there's two things that are being said there. There's one thing to say that we are creatures who are fundamentally seeking a sense of worth. It's another to say that we find it fundamentally in how people regard us. And I think we've talked about this before.
Well, it's not find. I didn't say find. I said
how
you
people
through the lens of others.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think is debatable, that component of it. I think it's, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. You think it's debatable that people do that?
Yes.
Or that people should do that?
No, I think it's true that I think a lot of people do that. I think it's debatable whether we should do it.
Yeah, so empirical psychologists aren't necessarily making claims about should. Psychotherapists would.
Right. The
claim of self-worth theory isn't should, at least at this point.
Right. But it's another thing that, well, are they universalizing that and saying that everyone is doing that? Or they're just saying most people do that? Or research just shows that, okay, or is that, I mean, they can make generalizations, I guess, and not universal claims per se.
Right. Well, now we're getting into the epistemology of research psychology. So to the extent that you're trying to, you have to start somewhere. You have to make some commitments. A paradigm sort of brings that, but many of those claims are unsupportable empirically. You can't. Right. There, at some point in the argument, there are claims, commitments, assumptions, premises that certainly are not. I would say are not definitively can be definitively supported with data. Research findings. So I think it's a starting point. It's an observation about the world from a lot of different sources and affirmed in some ways or confirmed in some ways with empirical findings. Okay. I do want to get to where you're going, which is if human beings have this tendency and that's even a norm or most people do it, does that mean we should do it? Does that mean we should do it better? I think that's what Rogerian psychotherapy goes toward. Oh, everybody does this, so you should think about how other people think of you and think positively about yourself through their eyes or something, or make them happy to make yourself happy, or forget how they think about you and think about only about yourself. That from a Buddhist point of view, both those things would be problematic.
No, this is where I'm kind of like, do we go right there or do we hold that off for a little while? Because I think that it's one thing to say, yeah, most people do that. It's another thing to say, well, that's just the way we are. And that's, how do you do that well? I think that's fraught with a lot of problems, but we can hold that off or if there's just more to talk about just the self-worth theory in general and its applications and how it would inform your own thought and just and your work and even Marty Covington's work as well. Yeah.
I mean, I think I'd like to bring it down to the level of self-worth theory of achievement motivation. So that's generally what I know something about. There's a lot into that framework that I don't know about. So let me try to go from self-worth theory to self-worth theory of achievement motivation that then generates hypotheses you would study empirically and suggest practices and things like that. So the self-worth theory paradigm is this way of looking at human beings. So people might say, oh, that sounds like something, that makes sense. You're kind of you're looking through the world for yourself. If you heard of Carl Rogers and then you're thinking about how other people view you. That was called the looking glass self. I learned that way back when, and that was the term from the 20s or 30s in sociology too. So there are these fundamental ideas that if you've read or studied or took a class in psychology or sociology, you may have heard. I don't know that it's always called self-worth theory. So if we keep just kind of continue with the word self-worth, theory is a little more specific than a paradigm and suggests frameworks. Some other big ideas that underlie this approach is that human beings are constructive, and we are constructionistic. So we construct a notion of ourselves. So words like self-concept come from this, right? We might say we have a self, we have a concept of ourselves. It's a mental construction that we make. That relationship of that construct and our self is not necessarily one-to-one, right? What we are and what we think we are not necessarily the same thing. And in part, that's because the human being, the human apparatus constructs meaning. It constructs everything, meaning we have expectations, we have beliefs, our prior experience influences how we interpret the current moment. How do we do that? Through cognitive structures, things we've learned, through beliefs. We have motivations and feelings, and that influences how we interpret a situation. It also interprets how we see ourselves. So the lens on ourselves is influenced by beliefs, values, our current emotional state, and particular ideas or frameworks or schemas that we're using at that moment to think about ourselves. And then of course there's a repeated factor. So that's what I mean by constructive. And there's a strong relationship parallel in Buddhist psychology. Constructionist says, well, we're a social constructionist says, well, where do we get some of these beliefs and thoughts? These are in the world, through ideology, through schooling, through social conditioning, cultural assumptions that are conveyed to us. Sometimes we don't even realize that we've internalized and been conditioned by. So that's an important point to make. It's not reducible to our brains and our brain functioning. Brains are integral, but they're not the ultimate. And so one thing you might take away is, wow, human beings and the thoughts they have about themselves and the way that they would pursue achieving a sense of self is pretty complicated. It's through these multi-dimensions of human beings and in relation to our society. And then Marty was an educational psychologist, so he said, okay, and I'm immersed in education too. So what about schooling as a social institution in particular might shape or influence or evoke certain dynamics if we start from this foundation or from the starting point? What might we see, and how might that lens help us understand some human behavior that seems strange or odd or irrational? So one example would be procrastination. People who really want to achieve actually ironically and counterintuitively procrastinate quite a lot. So from certain frameworks, if you're an economist, you're trying to explain that in one way. Well, there must be homo economists. That must make sense. It must be rational if a bunch of people are doing it. So how do we explain that from a rational paradigm? From a self-worth framework, you're not necessarily constrained by that. You're not saying people are irrational necessarily, but you have other explanatory mechanisms. What's motivating that? Why? What's the need or desire as a human being that's leading to, in this achievement context of schooling, for people to behave or act in this way? So that brings me to kind of the last phrase, self-worth theory of achievement context. So achievement contexts evoke, according to this framework, certain dynamics. One is schooling. Usually there's fewer rewards than those that are wanted by people. So not everybody can get A's. And even if everybody can get A, not everybody can be the best, can be ranked number one. There's a comparative component. Schooling is fundamentally evaluative. It's a kind of proving ground. You are evaluated. You get grades, and higher or lower, you get praise or not, affirmation. And these features, combined with our human legacy, being a human being, can lead to certain kinds of dynamics that we can observe. And some of them are not very helpful. And if you're an educational psychologist and you're trying to promote flourishing and well-being, creativity, fulfillment, meaning, intrinsic motivation, and then you see that people are not having those experiences in schooling, then you say, well, why not? And that's where you evoke self-worth theory of, in this case, achievement motivation, to try to explain that. And I'll say the last thing, that you're thinking about schools and achievement makes you a social psychologist, right? Because you're accounting for the institutional variety or features, the community, the culture in some way. And of course, then just to get to your question, then it's very hard to make universal claims. You've taken certain kinds of context. That we're going to study that. And we're choosing that because that context has particular features. So then extrapolating to all human beings, if you believe, again, that people construct their understanding of their context, then that breaks down. You wouldn't even be trying to do that, seems to me.
Can you explain that last point again? So in terms of if you believe that humans are constructing their sense of self in their context, their lived world, as I've heard it said, right?
Beautiful.
Then you wouldn't. Then what did you say? Then you, because of that, you wouldn't do what?
If you believe that if the social context is constitutive of your experience, your lived world, then, and you recognize that there are different ones with different features, and you wouldn't be making the same kind of you wouldn't be trying to make the same kind of universal claims that another kind of psychologist might.
Right, but that was different, because it's one thing to say that you construct your lived world. It's another to say that your context itself is determinative or heavily influential in that construction, right? I'm just trying to understand. Okay, so what you're saying, the latter?
I think I'm saying both. Wait, say your point again.
Well, initially there's the idea, the constructionist idea that, and I've actually used this myself, and I think this is what we're going, and I can do it from like a very physiological level of, the fact that like my experience of this conversation is something going on, it's constructed inside me, because the light has to hit my optical nerves, it has to run, there's a time delay, and then and inside me I'm putting together those impulses or messaging, and also sound and smell, all the senses are working together. So there's this world that I'm creating, this experience, this lived world that is mine and solely mine. And on top of that, it's not just those senses, it's also my previous experiences, my self and my quest for meaning and purpose, all that's being woven together into my lived world. So that's one thing, that's one claim. And then it's another to say that, well, your context in itself has been heavily influential in that construction, right? That seemed to be your second claim.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's constructionist versus constructivist.
Right. Okay. Yeah, which is important. Let's distinguish those two. Can you do that for folks?
Well, I think, I'll try. I think so. Constructivist, as my understanding, is more the individual, and particularly from cognition. So like our perceptions that you described, the organism perceives the world and the input, but it's not just sounds that I'm making, they're words that I'm making. And I'm putting them in, right? And those words have association.
Even the words I'm putting those sounds in together and forming the words, like I'm understanding the words. And that's something that, like, all I'm getting is a stream of sounds and impulses, and I'm putting this, I've learned to put those sounds into words. And then not even that, I'm not even thinking about the words, I'm just generally thinking about the meaning of what you're saying.
So is there I'm not sure.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm just being, I got Michael Polanyi in my back of my mind, and, his whole.
Right. So I think one thing is that there's one thread I heard there, is somehow that sensation and perception are prior to our constructive processes. And perception is fundamentally, the latest research shows, fundamentally influenced by what we bring to the situation. We have expectations, we have schema.
Yep.
There's, other than the kind of literal sensation, and even that is shaped by our organism, right? We feel pain or heat or something in a way that another organism would not. So it's still connected to us as a human being, and the organism as a Homo sapien, as a human, But in any case, the point is at the most basic level, we are making our reality. We are constructing it. And that is in part through concepts and language and meanings. And then also we have some continuity through time. So we bring our history of particular conditions, right? Experiences.
Yep.
You know, one thing a psychologist would also add, I think, is that the organism has predispositions. We can call them instincts. You can call them different kinds of things. But the organism has fundamental that are built into the drives, needs. These are words you might hear, instincts. I tend to agree with whatever you want to call them, that humans have a form, a body, needs, and these get expressed and are brought to the situation in various ways, especially through the cognitive dimension, which is the motivational, right? Self-worth theory would say that you can have learned needs as well as organismic needs, learned drives. Learned from what? From our experience in the world. Our world is in part shaped by society, culture, institutions, familial relations, particular familiar relationships, particular relationships to school. So that would be more the constructionist, right? That the meanings in our world, so you may have heard the social construction of gender or something, that these categories that we work and live with and use in our thinking do not exist in the world separate from their social construction, come in a variety of different ways. So I think that's more the constructionist kind of outside, but then it gets internalized. The constructivist is how does this organism make sense in the world? And I would say that, so this is my own little take, just because the social construction can only work because the organism is organized, number one, to care about the social world in some way, and to be able to process that. So I say, as pithily as possible, is that human beings are biologically determined or organismically determined to be socially determined.
And okay, so that's okay, and that's your personal take, you would say, or something you like?
It's my phrasing. It's my phrasing. It's my phrasing. I'd say what I'm trying to emphasize relative to some others is that we don't have some DNA in us that then is just unspools and we act in the world, nor are we impervious, nor do we not bring something as a being, as a human organism to our social and psychological interactions. We have a legacy that's a human legacy that's in the organism, in me.
So, and that's a different type of claim. And just need to understand, as we said before, it's one thing to say people tend to be this way, or most of us are this way versus they should be this way, where your claim seems to be at least leaning towards the latter a bit, would you say? Or are you still trying to maintain this observational?
So here's the corollary. Here's another point. Well, there's some both. I think when I say this, that's clearly from my reading of a bunch of stuff and not reading of a bunch of stuff. I've missed a bunch of stuff. I don't know all the stuff that's out there, but I'd like to operate in the world and kind of know what I believe. So I think another point that I would make is, so I'm definitely not a biological determinist. I recognize the predisposition of the organism. I think a lot of people hear, oh, you have these predispositions, the instincts, you have the drive to procreate or to live in the world, right? That we have this thing. I said we do. That comes with our legacy. I think that often leads people to think that that's somehow absolute or very fixed. And that's where something I think I disagree with a lot of other people. They just seem to assume like that the instinct overwhelms everything else. And I'd say that's obviously ridiculous. So think about the self-preservation is the most powerful human drive, most people would say. Well, how many people have died for other people? Well, that doesn't make any sense then. It's not that you don't have it, it's just not absolute.
Right.
It's not fixed. And in fact, and this might be we can also say procreation. How many monks, how many people have taken vows of abstinence of sex? Billions. Okay, it's a powerful need, powerful drive, but it's not all consuming. It's not overwhelming. So and if you notice what consistently is more powerful, it's the same kind of thing. It's a value. It's a principle. could be hardly more farther away from the biologicalness of us, it seems to me, right? So we have them, but I would say, but they don't have the fixedness or the power that just seem to be assumed by the words. Oh, you have a human drive or self-preservation. Well, just that's where the observation comes in. Well, how does it operate in the world? Anything you can say is this most really powerful drive, I can point out to literally millions of counterexamples. So it's not that it's not there, it's just not what you think a drive is. It doesn't have the status of the thing you call drive or instinct, just isn't as fixed and ubiquitous and powerful as you imagine. And there is literally something else more powerful. And that something else is an idea, a principle, a belief. And that, from a biological point of view, most of those paradigms don't have a way of thinking about that. Like, how could that be? Because that's not built into the organism per se.
Right.
I don't know. So this is pretty abstract. You're right to say you're kind of getting far away from psychology and the empirical. You're absolutely right.
Well, I mean, I think I've mentioned Jim Loder, who is very influential to me in my spiritual and intellectual development. And he was a trained psychologist, and so he respected the field of psychology, but he also said, it does have its sphere.
Absolutely.
But there are others. There's something that we have to respect, and so that's where I know just in my readings, I do more in the Christian world, where I think that's at risk, where we're so influenced by psychology and a lot of Christian thought these days that we tend to forget that's that it has its limits. But that's for another time. So I want to go back and ask you, because this is a really interesting point that I haven't seen it in Kierkegaard scholarship, but it is in Kierkegaard, and it's this this idea in kind of 19th century idealism that part of this dynamic of spirit is that the human spirit or whatever, because it in Hegel, which is talking about the absolute spirit coming, going through history, and the spirit is trying to realize itself and who it is. And Kierkegaard, whether he admits this or not, is influenced by that. And this whole idea of self-relationality is based on this dynamic. So Kierkegaard just locates it in the individual, not in world history, like Schelling and then Hegel. And in fact, Kierkegaard, I've actually written on this. He's more influenced by Fichte, but okay, not trying to really bore people to death here. But it's a really interesting point in that, and you mentioned this, that in trying to understand who you are in this quest for self-worth, or to understand who you are, there's this discord. Like, you have a perception of yourself, and somehow that is inadequate. But what creates the inadequacy? Or how do you even sense that it's inadequate? It's a really interesting question, because there has to be something, yourself has to be something more than what you realize about yourself to have a sense that this is not quite right. And this is what Kierkegaard really drives a lot of his thought, is that we are in a way always failing to completely understand who we are, and thus there is this anxiety and despair. And that's really fascinating, because it really is counter to a lot of later existential thought. Anyway, I'm just curious if you've come across anyone who's explored that at all or talked about it.
Well, my couple thoughts. I mean, my first thought is, from a relatively conventional, and again, my mentor Marty was not necessarily conventional. I don't know how conventional Loder was. That question is kind of out of bounds in some sense. It's really hard to empirically address. No, so I think a thoughtful, philosophically inclined or humanly inclined psychologist might say, that's a really good question. It's important. That's a phenomenon. You've described something in human experience. There's some sort of gap between who our ability to who we are or who we think we are and our ability to understand that. And then who's doing that? Who is the what's necessary to even notice that gap, so to speak? I mean, I never quite thought of it that way, so thank you. So I would turn more to Buddhism and Buddhist psychology.
Yeah. Just to be clear, I wasn't saying psychologist. I didn't want to.
Yeah.
Because you're right. In a way, it's not within the field itself to really explore that. We're really going beyond that.
But I would hope thoughtful psychologists are asking. Just because you're not empirically exploring it doesn't mean, I think so. One point to be made that is, I think there's some valuable insights from psychology, empirical psychology, meaning research. But there's a bunch of stuff that's really hard for scientific psychology to study because it's not objective. And that's what it needs to be. And, a subjectivity by definition is not objective. So, but a psychologist might say, well, human beings aren't necessarily designed to understand themselves. That's not how we've evolved to be, right? If you adopt an evolutionary paradigm, there's nothing that's not surprising. In fact, we'd be surprised if people did fully understand themselves. Concepts like called unconsciousness, and I don't know if Freud coined that, but I doubt he did. But trying to get at that there are things that we do and think and feel and processes that we're not aware of as human organisms, any more than a whale or a fox is fully aware of its processes. Just because we have this incredible mind doesn't mean it's perfect. We can know everything about ourselves. So that's one probably somewhat unsatisfactory answer. But I think if you're asking me, there is some mystery in being a human being. Maybe it's possible for somebody or some people to understand. But I think it's okay to say maybe humans can't fully understand themselves as a species, let alone an individual organism. That's a heretical claim for scientists, but science is a social construction. It's made up. Just because that's a useful starting point that everything could be studied and could be understood. That's a okay premise to then demonstrate. And if you start with that, then great, keep asking. But that doesn't make it true. So can humans fully understand the human condition? Can individual humans understand themselves fully in all its dimensions? I don't need to answer that affirmatively to live in the world myself. And I think certain kinds of Buddhists would say maybe, but that knowledge is not going to be acquired through concepts or language. It's going to be experienced through introspection and contemplation. And there's direct access to one's own lived world, one's own experience that no one else could ever get to. Now, then but are you accessing your true self or something at that point? From what I can tell from reading Buddhism, there's lots of differences of opinion about that. But some certainly say even that, no, that there is no true self. There is no fundamental self. This is a construct. And that was one of the key points, that any notion, any idea by definition is constructed. So if you have an idea of a true self, why would that concept be different than any other concept that you've constructed through the processes we talked about before, the constructivism and the social constructionism? Self-concept, it's still a concept. It's in the word, self-concept. So that leaves us with a mystery, I guess, from a Buddhist. But if you adopt that perspective, that leaves us with a question. It also leaves us a possibility. What, from the Kierkegaardian or the Frawleyan perspective?
Frawley. Well, it's interesting. I mean, I can go kind of pre-Kierkegaard because obviously, again, probably going to bore people, but you had Immanuel Kant, and he created a real problem for thinkers after him, because this distinction between noumena and phenomena, like as we talked about, he was kind of the original constructivist constructionist, in the sense of that we are experiencing the world through our own processes, through senses and input and whatnot, so that how things really are in themselves, we can never know. And so there's this gap, that seems to be, this really jeopardizes like true knowledge, like how, if we can really know anything. And that really bothered folks that came after him. And so you had this movement of idealism, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, who try to overcome that gap between phenomena and noumena. And Fichte's answer was that, well, so going to get really technical, Kant rejected this thing called intellectual intuition. We have sensible intuition, but not intellectual intuition. Like this idea that we can know, and I haven't studied it in decades, but it's basically Fichte picks up on this term as a way to say that God is working, like we can kind of have a sense of God, the absolute spirit, whatnot, and we are working out, discovering who we are in the world and the absolute through ethical activity. That's what Fichte ran with. Schelling made it historical, like this is a quest throughout history, and which Hegel really capitalized on. And the absolute spirit, the phenomenology spirit, the spirit's coming to know itself through world history and whatnot. And Kierkegaard thought this was complete bunk. This is really ridiculous, and was just abstractions from himself. But Kierkegaard, as we talked about in a book called Sickness Unto Death, talked about this self-relationality that we use. But he says that there's a sense in which we are always trying to figure out who we are. That's actually wrapped up in every choice, and every thought that we have is in part, who am I, and what do I have meaning, and what's the good life for me, and whatnot. These are happening every single moment. We're just, most of the time, we're unaware of that because we're so preoccupied and our attention is elsewhere. For Kierkegaard, though, he says that ultimately rest, this state of rest, is when we rest transparently in the power that posits us, which is very abstract language. But basically, he's saying that when you are resting in the presence of God, then there's peace. And part of that is to see that you are nothing, as he would say, nothing less than nothing before God, which is getting into kind of mystical thought and whatnot that we don't need to get into. So Kierkegaard had an answer. And whether you believe that or not, there is his work on the dynamics of human nature. And he obviously wasn't an empirical psychologist. He was just going around observing people and kind of saying, okay, I see people doing these things. What makes sense of how people tend to act?
Let me just say, he's empirical. He's just not researched.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So there's a conflation there. The Buddha wasn't a scientist, but he was empirical.
Right. No, that's a good point. Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Yeah, so he was empirical. And I think I've talked about this before, how people would cross the street, not want to talk to him because he was so preoccupied with that. But what's interesting to me, and why I find it so fascinating, is because it really explains a lot of behavior. I think it's easy for us to kind of abstract away from the human and get caught up in ideas and thoughts and, oh, this person said this about me, and I'm just worried about what they said, versus, well, why did they say that to me, and what was motivating them, and why am I reacting in this way? We don't really think about that. We're just thinking about what they said and the ideas. And yet what's really fundamental, what's going on inside me and that other person and everyone, is this quest for self-worth, for meaning, and self-relationality is a way to kind of understand that dynamic and why it's always present, and it's fundamental to who we are. So now the question is, to me, it's not a question of whether or not, well, that's how I put this. It just makes a lot of sense to me. I just feel it's really interesting. And then this other idea that I've kind of unearthed in Kierkegaard, which I haven't seen in Kierkegaard research, which granted I haven't been involved with, and maybe someone has done the hard work, but there's this really interesting idea of we are compelled to try to understand who we truly are, and so that makes us create these constructions and construct these lived worlds and understanding of ourselves in that lived world. And why it's not static, why we're always wrestling, is because life is, temporal, but also that deep down we kind of realize, this is not quite right, this is not quite right. Like in a kind of a so what way of understanding that is we tend to think of ourselves in terms of roles. Like I'm a father, a husband, consultant, whatever. And we kind of hope that we put these all together, they'll create meaning, and they kind of help. But for a lot of people, they're somehow too finite, right? They're just too small. We're something more than that. And then, or we want to be more than that, even though, but we still want to be in those roles and doing well in those roles, hopefully, but not solely defined by those roles. And so that tension is really interesting. And this idea of who am I, kind of, this doesn't seem, I'm attracted to this, but it's not quite right. That dynamic is really interesting. I think Kierkegaard, to me, does a really great job with at least explaining or putting, words to what's going on there. So there's my rambling.
Well, I think that unpacking of the subject of experience, I'm not a Kierkegaard scholar, but that as a source of crucial knowledge and insight about the human condition is a kind of empiricism, in the sense that it's empirical to me and I'm looking inward, and that's really crucial. And that is the basis of a lot of Buddhist knowledge. Then there's, you talk about it, you compare. So sounds like Kierkegaard was going around trying to talk to other people, like, what's it like for you? Or ask, and even just have these little mini experiments. I'm not quite sure. Those probably did different things. In the Buddhist tradition, this is called the Sangha. And you talk about it, and then you write it down, and you argue about it, and you debate it. And you create some abstractions about human psychology. It's called the Abhidharma. But I think it's interesting that you talk about this rest as a crucial state. It sounds like for gaining insight. Well, that's meditation. And you talked about a kind of unease. I mean, so there's I'm not going to say is meditation. It's analogous in the Buddhist tradition to that the purpose of meditation isn't to feel good. It's to gain insight into the nature of your reality. Actually, vipassana, insight. Now, and if we can get sort of through some of the emotional state or the certain cognitions or beliefs, then that can help us gain a clear understanding. And without that, our dispositions are to make self-centered meaning, I might say, rather than selfless meaning. We interpret at least some less than that. I have some doubts whether maybe I'm just not skilled. I'm definitely not skilled enough in meditation to get to this state where I'm not being influenced by my unease. But another parallel is in Buddhism is to say that the starting point for most of us in the conventional world is an unease. That's the ground in which we live. Is it possible to get beyond that? They would say, for some people, that would be Nirodha and Nirvana. Yes, you can get back past that. But I think more concretely, the so what, now you were talking about the self-concept, I am. So I think we're carrying around, and then in school context, remember achievement motivation, I am smart. If I'm at Princeton, or I'm dumb, I'm not smart. And if that's my identity, do I need to demonstrate that? And do I need to protect that? What do I think I need to do to protect that? I am a good student, a little bit different. I'm principled. I do what people want me to do. I act in ways that I think comport with this set of values or principles of being good, right? And so that's what's driving my actions and aspiration to do that. Or I am successful. I have to be, because that's who I am. If I'm not getting certain grades, then I'm not successful. That's not a role, as you were talking about exactly, but it is a definition of oneself. And then from a self-worth point of view in school. In our American society, that's where the constructionist point of view comes in. Being capable, having potential, is the basis for worthiness. So the worthiness is the most core, but in our social world right now, today, in school, as a young person in Princeton University or someplace else, how do I demonstrate my worthiness? By showing I'm capable. How? By either achieving achieving things, or in the case of a procrastination, is maintaining the possibility that I'm capable and brilliant and smart, even if I don't perform. Because that's the more basic thing. That's the more basic drive. So that's the angle from a self-worth perspective. That's not a Buddhist, but it is rooted in this basic idea. I have this sense of self. I need to protect it. I need to defend it. Especially if you've been selected based upon that.
Yeah, that's helpful. I was wondering, because I wanted to, we tend to go off into these really abstract conversations, which you and I both love. But then coming back to the so what. So I have a particular so what I thought we could talk about. But before that, I just want to make sure that in terms of self-worth theory of achievement motivation, have we kind of really nailed that, or have you explicated what you wanted to in that, or is there more to be said, or can you even remember what we said?
I mean, that's kind of I'm at the edge of my ability and capability, and it's partly I'm trying to represent self-worth theory, but also I've been thinking about it so long in relation to, I don't know what's mine and I've made up and what is reflective of the field. But right. I think probably we should turn to the so what. I guess I would just say, to try to encapsulate what I've tried to say, is human beings carry around this self-concept. We carry, in an academic context, we carry around an academic self-concept. In elite environments where I tend to work, where you're selected based upon your capability, then that, and maybe in a work environment, right, or an athletic environment, any kind of achievement context, it's understandable that that would be salient to you, and you think it's salient to others, and that notion then shapes how you're interacting with other people, how you're regarding yourself, how you're even perceiving this environment. And it's I think people, upon reflection, can see concretely, I'm not asking that question because I don't want to look dumb. Well, why not? Well, because I need to protect this sense of self. So that's getting close to. But this is operating, as you've said, it's not only a paramount need, it's ubiquitous. It's operating all the time, whether we're aware of it or not. And I think for the purposes of self-worth theory and kind of making a connection with your framework, hopefully we've done that.
Nice. Well, I thought we've talked about procrastination, and another course we've thought about was imposter syndrome. And so I thought, as a kind of a so what, I thought that would be kind of a good use case, because it seems so obvious that what your work and can really unpack, and what so many people struggle with, which is imposter syndrome. Would that be okay for you to just maybe talk a little bit about that and the work because I know you've done some research and perhaps even some writing on imposter syndrome. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if I'd say, just to be clear, research, not in this case, not empirical research.
Right.
I have not done that.
Reading.
Yeah. So I've read about so what I might call in psychology, relatively conventional psychological, in the field of psychology, and which is based on some research, interpretations of what's going on in imposter syndrome. And then there's some more sociological ones that I think a self-worth theory framework is at least as useful to unpack that. So I would say, and I think self-worth theory, for instance, when I talk about this in imposter syndrome, I point out how common this is. There's a quote literally from Einstein at the end of his life saying, he puts it very well. He says something like, "Oh, I'm the high praise that people heap on me makes me doubt my capability, whether I'm worthy of it." Okay, all right. If Einstein felt imposter syndrome, like, who's going to escape that? Because sometimes the discourse is certain people experience it, not others, and I don't think that's useful to try to, from a fundamental point of view. But Okay, so having said that, he says, wow, people have this regard of me. So imposter, and I think the term is unhelpful. Imposter is someone pretending to be somebody else. But imposter syndrome is when you think other people think you are not who you know yourself to be. That is a very different thing. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to pretend I'm somebody else. I think you think I'm somebody else. And in particular, not just somebody else, you think I have certain abilities that I don't think I have. I am not a genius. I am not brilliant in the way you think I am. Now, undisputable is the achievements. So you've taken the achievements and said, wow, you've published these papers when you're 17. You're a genius. You won this chess tournament. You're a born natural. And then you're looking at all your failures and your limitations, or you don't see that. And so you say, maybe you tell me that. I'm thinking, no, I'm not. Or they don't say anything, but you think that they think because of your resume, you're this thing, this person. But I would argue, right, I have achieved all these things because I have this thing in me. I am a genius. I'm a prodigy. I'm a natural. I have this incredible mathematical mind, whatever you can call it. Okay. Many people, and notice that many people who, when other people say that to them, they say, yeah, I worked at it 10 hours a day for 30 years. What are you talking about? And they push back and say, it's not innate. It's not inborn. You have this concept of me. It's not true. And they push back and say it out loud. So I would say what's going on here, what's common to a lot of these imposter syndrome scenarios is underlying is a belief of how people are really good at something, where expertise comes from. And that is very much a fixed mindset, is that it's innate, largely unchanging, and that the root, and that you're born with it, and there's not much you can do about it, and it's pervasive. And that's built into self-worth theory of achievement motivation. It's this false belief, a set of concepts, interlocking beliefs and ideas people are not even aware of about ability and its relationship to performance and then worth.
Can I ask, so if you think that ability is fixed, or you assume that, then it's always going to perform. It's always going to succeed.
You're genius all the time.
Right. Yeah. So versus when you look at yourself, you're like, well, that's not the case. I have failed. I want to cover. So
I would say both parties, if we just imagine one external person projecting onto somebody else that they are a genius, and then the supposed genius feeling like an imposter, both hold a false view of how people get really good at something. And it's very similar. So this person says, because you've performed so well, you must be innately a genius. And then the person who did it thinks, not only do they know that other people think that, it's also valued. We value innate genius more than anything else in our society. They know that's not the case because their experiences, they failed a bunch of times, they were confused. The very act of spending decades studying something proves you're not a genius, because if you were, you just get it. So they know that's not how they got there to this attainment.
So then
they feel like an imposter relative to this belief in society that experts become experts by virtue of genius, not by effort or strategy or learning from other people. That all proves you're not a genius, because if you were, you wouldn't need to do that.
So, okay, so I'm a first-year student at a prestigious university. I'm struggling with imposter syndrome. I'm believing that, wow, the admissions office thinks I'm this type of person. I know I'm not that. So they've made a mistake. And so what does that drive me to do? What is that? I mean, it creates a lot of anxiety. Does it just freak me out and make me study 100 times more than I would otherwise? Or
it can.
Yeah.
Right. So I might say, well, I'm not a genius, but I'm still motivated to attain. So what do I need to do? I need to do more. I need to work harder. And notice this is based on a conception. So if it's a fixed ability, then you don't necessarily think, well, the method or the strategy or what are the fundamental ways of thinking? Can I develop my ability to visualize in 3 dimensions and I'd be a better physicist? All those things are off the table because you think it's fixed. Now, so what's not fixed? Your effort. So it's a very narrow view of achievement. It's just ability plus effort. And so if those are the only components, and I think my ability is fixed, but I've seen that effort can make a difference, but that effort doesn't change me. It changes my performance.
Right.
Whereas if I cultivate some capacity, some capabilities, that changes me. I can become more logical. I can become more analytical. I can become more skillful in processing information. I can acquire new tools for learning. I can do all these different things that in some way are more transformative of me, that are not pure effort or time. And it's a more, I would also add, it's a more accurate understanding from what research scientists, but it's not the conventional belief. So so going back to your point, so either I can double down and grind, or I can say, I could try to conceal that I'm not a genius in various ways.
So, so obviously there's 2 players here. There's the individual, the student, or the someone new into enters the working world and whatever, and they're overwhelmed. They're feeling like, imposter syndrome isn't confined to the universities. It's, it's pervasive. So there's work they can do to help themselves out, as we've talked about, like, not seeing their ability as fixed, that there's strategies on how to one, take it easier on yourself, but also to adapt and, through creative problem solving and whatnot, those ideas. I'm curious about what you would say, let's say university setting, or even in, the working world. What could be done to change that signaling in order to fight imposter syndrome?
Well, what I've tried to do is say, you probably carry around this simple model that achievement, attainment, performance is due to ability plus effort. And it's not that effort doesn't matter and ability doesn't matter. They do, but not in the amount and in the ways that you imagine. And in fact, if you ask people who've achieved a lot, they will tell you that. They will say, this is how I got here. And it doesn't comport to your false, simplistic beliefs, but they are really powerful in our society. We are actually blinded. Even when people tell us, what's the secret of your success? I was fascinated and passionate about what I was learning. Like, yeah, but you're a genius. They'll literally deny and dismiss. Happens all the time. Oh, I spent hours and years studying this thing. Yeah, but you were a genius. And so without that, you wouldn't have made it. They dismiss, but then that's the time. But I think another message is thinking about all the different ways you can get good at something that are not ability plus effort. Techniques, strategies, skills, community, tools, creative problem solving, and you can cultivate all of these things. You can get, these things that we think are biological and innate. More people, apparently, from the reading the research, learn perfect pitch than are born with it. What is more basic biological quality relative to music than perfect pitch? Nothing, but it's not fixed. More people can learn it than are born with it, who are musicians. Well, what does that tell us about our capacity for growth, for malleability, plasticity? So we need to get people to understand, but it's not just through effort. So sometimes the message is, oh, well, just work hard. You're not there yet, without unpacking, well, what's the process? And then what's the fuel for that? It's often not directly to get better. It's to serve other people. That's the source of the energy to invest 10 years in something, to express oneself beautifully in art, because they're fascinated and curious by something. And then the outcome is an incredible capacity. So you read what Nobel Prize winners in science say. They almost, why, how? So we need to unpack these processes. People are based a bunch of these decisions on a bunch of beliefs that are not true. And in fact, there's a bunch of evidence that shows us this not to be true, these false beliefs. But the narrative, the assumption, especially in American society, is so powerful that that lens literally blinds people to it. Let me give you one example. I remember, I still have this somewhere because I was teaching this probably close to 25 years ago, this idea of that we had this false belief and how powerful it was in our society. And there's an article, was when I followed football much more. There's an article about Larry Fitzgerald. Do you remember Larry Fitzgerald? He's a receiver for the
Cardinals.
He's like one of the top 5 in history. Yeah. Okay, the article is called The Natural. That was literally the title. Then the whole article explains how he's not very fast, actually. He's kind of big and not super quick. And then it explains how his father was a coach for the Minnesota Vikings, and he was on the field learning from one of the best receivers since he's been 10, 12 years old and catching balls and all these technical things. They're the opposite of natural ability. Literally, the article is explaining all the ways that it's not natural at all. That in fact, he had less natural endowment than most of his peers, yet was far exceeding them. And how? Certainly through practice, but it kind of helps that your community includes someone who's a professional in the field and then gives you access to another super professional. That's the social dimension, right? Well, why was he so motivated to keep doing this? Well, he's on the field. He's great people. It's exciting. He sees what it's like to be a professional player. If you really unpack that. So there's both that article shows, yes, you got to work hard in the physical part and the technique and the skill and then the tools. And he had high end, everything. And then he had mentorship and guidance and motivation. And he had a clear vision. He could see it. But on the one hand, you see what goes into becoming an expert and how powerful a fixed mindset is, that it literally blinded the journalist. Not Larry Fitzgerald, to his credit. He never said, I'm a natural. And so I think that really captures what's going on in our society. This narrative is so powerful, these certain beliefs about achievement, that we don't even the person dispelling the myth doesn't realize they're dispelling the myth.
Right. No, that's great. I appreciate that. And I think what we'll do is pick this up again next week. So we wanted to this week talk about self-worth theory. And as we mentioned early in this talk, Nic wrote a book called Life Beyond Grades. And we thought we'd talk about that next week because it has self-worth theory. And it's obviously trying to address some of the struggle students have in higher ed. And so I think it's if you watched our talk on student agency, this is another good one that just talks about some of the dynamics in college setting. So good place to end, Nic, just trying to wrap this up. All right. Well, Nic, thanks so much. As always, really appreciate your insights and our discussions, and we'll pick it up next week.
Thank you, Matt.